Welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to introduce you the major events panel. We have a very distinguished panel of guests. From my left to right, we have Tom Grilk, Executive Director of the Boston Athletic Association and the Boston Marathon. Tim McManus from ACOM. ACOM is a company involved in many of the Olympics and the World Cup for the past 3 decades. Doug Arnault, who was the CEO of London 2012 and is involved in many of the Olympics, the Summer and Winter Olympics. And the moderator will be Angela Ruggiero, a 4-time Olympic medalist and member of the IOC and the United States Olympic Committee. This panel will go into 11:20. We will leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have questions, please text 22333 and start your question with globes. And you can tweet your questions to @Paul and start your question with globes. And please hashtag SSAC14. With that, I'll hand over to Angela.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So welcome this morning. Today we're going to be talking about global games, the economics of major sporting competitions. And I think to start out, I just want to talk a little bit about my own experience. I was an athlete in 4 Olympics in women's ice hockey. When I showed up to each games, everything was perfect. All I had to concentrate on was competing. I didn't have to worry about the infrastructure or the transport. I didn't have to worry about where I was going to eat. I just got to show up and compete. And I think in these major sporting competitions, that's the ultimate goal. What you don't realize as an athlete is the enormous amount of planning that goes into putting one of these games on. And you don't even think about what's going to happen to those venues and those infrastructure that's been built afterwards. So today I think we want to spend some time discussing what goes into games, what goes into hosting major sporting competitions, both the benefits and the risks, and what should happen afterwards. So to start it out, I want to talk to Doug and just ask him, with all of your experience and recognizing that in the Olympics, for example, the bid may start 2 years prior to the vote, and then you have 7 years, and then you have this long legacy afterwards. So you're talking about decades for one, 2 or 3 week competition. There's tremendous risk involved. There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of people that are a part of that. Why host a major sports competition?
I'm currently involved in working for the United States Olympic Committee with a number of different cities across the United States to take a look and understand whether or not we are going to bid for 2024. And that is the question that we are asking. But the way we're posing the question is not a sort of typical return on investment kind of approach. What we're asking and what we ask of any city is, where do you want to be 30 years from now? Where do you want your city to be? Tell us what your master plan could be, and then tell us how an Olympics might enhance that master plan, might add more to your city as you grow, and may in fact accelerate the planning to get your city to where you might be 30 years from now and get you there earlier. In other words, how does something like the Olympic Games fit into your plan as a city? Not let's look at the Olympic Games and then figure out what might happen after the fact. And for us, that's critical because it leads to responsible bidding and responsible planning. But it's the answer then is what is it that event ultimately is going to contribute to the development of the fabric of your city and the future of your city, which is a long-term play, not a short-term play. And it is really one of the few things that, few answers that we can provide that says it's worth all of the investment that you just talked about.
So with that being said, you're talking about legacy. I serve on the evaluation commission for the 2018 Olympics, and now I'm on the coordination commission with the IOC. We get thick books that you guys help us prepare, and the IOC members should read every sentence, which definitely the evaluation commission looks at. One thing that is in there is legacy, and you already mentioned that. So I was wondering, Tim, if you could talk a little bit about London's legacy and how the London Olympics did such an amazing job, and if you're putting together these bid books, you're putting together these global games, how do you start thinking about legacy so early before you're actually bidding?
I think it's a great question. I think, as Doug said as well, when you look at any of the world games, if you think within a 4-year span, there are 18 major world game events that go on. So this is continuous. For London 2012, right after the selection, we were the first consultant brought on board, and one of the first things we did, in addition to the master plan for the games, was the development of the legacy strategy for East London, because it was a wasteland, it was a toxic site, and that had to be regenerated. And that was a major component that went into the early planning as opposed to a last-minute consideration. When you look now in terms of not just the park, but the schools that have been developed, the housing that's been developed, the permanent jobs that have been created, these are part of the legacy that goes on, as opposed to something like the bird's nest that's just sitting there, not being utilized in Beijing right now, except for tours. So I think from a sense like that, if you look at Qatar with the World Cup in 2022, as Doug said before, this is part of an overall strategy. They have a Vision 2030 in Qatar of how the whole country will be developed, of which 2022 World Cup is part of that.
So it's interesting. Tom, you do a lot with, we're talking about legacy from a major standalone event. The whole world is watching at the London Games, but in your situation, and part of the Boston Marathon, that's every year. That's been going on for over a century. How do you think about legacy and or the impact that your event specifically has on the city of Boston, but perhaps on the nation?
Well, for us, we have no choice but to focus on legacy because that is precisely what we are. The Boston Marathon has been around for 118 years. And we at the Boston Athletic Association are not the least bit confused about who owns that event. And it is the 2 to 3 million people who live around here and hundreds of thousands of runners around the world who embrace it every year. Part of our job, an important part of it, is to make sure that we enhance and continue that legacy. An event like that presents a choice, as Doug and Tim describe what people go through in deciding how and whether to bid for the Olympics. A question for them really is, what problem are they solving? And it may be, as happened in London, a solution to an issue of, among other things, urban blight, or it may be that one would want to create something that comes back year after year after year, a different sort of event, and it presents an interesting element to those questions.
So I think we heard just a bit about, I know from an athlete's standpoint, your life has changed by attending one of these events. I mean, literally, you have a memory that will last a lifetime. You inspire people from all over the world that I think believe they can do more. But that comes at a cost. And in Sochi's case, 50 billion plus cost. That number may be a little bit misconstrued. So I was hoping, Doug, you could maybe articulate a little bit about what a big time budget looks like. Is it truly $50 billion, or, as you mentioned before, the breakup between the OCOG and the non-OCOG budget, and just explain, like, what is the actual investment?
Yeah, I mean, Angela and I were both in Sochi, and I worked on Sochi for some time. We had an opportunity to see this massive development, but it is critical when you look at these budgets to be able to distinguish two budgets that go into the bidding process. One is what we call the OCOG budget, or the organizing committee budget, and one is the non-OCOG budget. When you hear these figures like 51 billion, and none of us, frankly, will ever know how accurate that number is, if it's more, if it's less. But when you hear those numbers, what you're really talking about, the overwhelming amount of money from that side of the budget is going into permanent infrastructure for the city or the region. It's going into the roads that went up to the mountains. It's going into the train that went to the mountains. It's going into the infrastructure that had to be put in for the venues themselves. More and more what is happening in games is we're seeing there's a struggling balance between the OCOG, the non-OCOG budget, which is that permanent infrastructure. Think about roads, think about transport, think about housing, think about things that are part of that long-term legacy that is going to stay behind for the city. And then the balance of the budget, the OCOG budget, which tends to be closer to about $3 billion, and is pretty closely managed to that number from games to games, is really the money to put on the games themselves. The struggle that we're having is we're finding that it is more and more beneficial for us to take a look at venues as temporary venues that are built specifically for the games, and then they're literally, the kit of parts is packed up and sent on. And we return the use of the particular land to either what it was before. For example, Greenwich Park in London is actually a better park today than it was before the games, or it gets turned over for a very different use. So that the distinguishing between those two budgets, you would probably find in Sochi, I think the numbers that we were looking at the end was about 3.1 billion in terms of the operating cost budget, and obviously that other huge number out there for the enormous infrastructure that was put into to the Sochi area.
Thanks for that clarification. I think it really helps illuminate, there's a lot of investment in the infrastructure, and in some cities it's exorbitantly large than if you go to a city that has this infrastructure already built. So when thinking about hosting a games, you're 7 years out, you're bidding to win, say, an Olympic bid or a World Cup bid. What are some lessons perhaps you could give to these potential cities in terms of their development and keeping their budget within means, and just considerations that you need to balance when putting your budget together, when especially maybe you could talk about Rio, where you're having political turmoil and people are pointing to the World Cup, they're pointing to the Olympics, and how do you balance that out?
Angela, it's a great question. Let me give you, this is an analytics conference, so let me give you some numbers and facts. We all love numbers, being an engineer, I love numbers. Ben Flyberg from the University of Oxford at the Saïd Business School did the preeminent analysis of Olympic Games costs. Since 1960 to 2010, 100% of the Olympic Games ran over their budget, 100%. 41% of those games had no budget reconciliation, so nobody could say how much you overspent, it just happened. The average cost overrun for the Olympic Games in that period of time was 179% of the original bid budget. These numbers are staggering, so when you talk about lessons learned for a host city or a candidate city, how do you look back to mitigate potential cost overruns? We've cataloged the top 10 lessons learned. Probably the top 3 from what we've seen. Number 1 is the failure to include a legacy component, as we've talked about before. Number 2 is the failure to include an integrated transportation network and that overall infrastructure around the games in the city or the venues. And 3 is the failure to take into account sustainability in terms of the overall development of the site, of the venues, of the city, or whatever the areas are. Then the rest are more management and control. The other aspect that we see very clearly is the issue of governance with the host city. Is the ones that have done it well, like London, have established governance controls very early on in that 7-year lifespan that you talk about. But in many cases, like Rio, we see that struggled all the way through to the point where right now there is some still lack of governance, which is impacting the major decisions that have to be made.
Well, yeah, that's it's illuminating, I think, and I look at the budgets, and as an athlete, you said you don't really understand how big it could be. Maybe back to Doug. Can you play off of Tim's comments and help us understand then how do you get to that number? You're going over the number, but who's going to pay for the overage, and how does a games put on such a large budget?
Yeah, it's a struggle. I mean, one of the things I think that in the United States, we actually have had a good history of actually turning a profit on games, and I can actually get into how we've been able to do that too, because we take a very capitalist approach, but it also goes back to what you talked about beforehand, which is looking at cities which have a good deal of the infrastructure already in place and not doing this whole sort of sea change that you have. But the struggle in terms of keeping the budgets in line, again, to defer to the title of this conference, a great deal of it has to do with if we do the right analysis beforehand, if the analysis is done during the bid cycle, and if the owner of the event, the IOC, is more demanding in terms of the analysis on the front end, then you can do much better on the back end. The problem is that the bar continues to move even after you have bid. When you bid a games, it may be that we've all agreed that these are the events, these are the numbers of sessions, this is what the television schedule is going to be, but a great deal of that changes after you have bid. I mean, if you talk about Rio, and this is minor in terms of Rio, but Rio added 2 sports. That's significant. The numbers of sessions that you have during the games can grow significantly. Each ticketed session requires additional personnel, additional equipment, and things of that sort. But the management of it really has to do, from my perspective right now, is we need much closer cooperation with the international sports federations who make up the sports of the games and are managed for the games only by the IOC. And we need to be much more reasonable about what is required for a particular sport. If you have a team handball competition and that team handball competition is in Denmark, then a 10,000-seat facility makes sense. If that same team handball competition is going to be in Rio, then a facility of 4,000 makes sense. But you have something called the Program Commission within the IOC, which is judging whether or not a sport is going to be in the games or stay in the games. And it's calibrated on the number of tickets that are sold, the number of TV hours that you have, and so on and so forth. And so the federations are motivated to ask for more. Those demands are thrown onto the organizing committee, and the organizing committee is continually trying to sort of adjust that bar as you go on. But to go back to something that came up with Tim, the hard work, I worked on the Chicago bid for 2016, we bid those games as if we were going to run those games. And we bid the games saying that we are going to be held to this budget, and we did a tremendous amount of detailed analysis beforehand to be able to say that responsibly to the people of Chicago and the people of the region, that if in fact it was our responsibility to host those games, we were going to be able to stage those games, host those games, deliver them within the budget or relatively close to the budget that was being bid. I don't think that there's enough of that hard work done beforehand. I think in many, many cases, the sales people who are on the front end aren't the delivery people who are on the back end, common problem in business, and therefore you have the ones who have sold it aren't in the room when you have to make those budgets.
It's an interesting point, though. In the U.S., obviously, guarantees are everything. We're talking about the IOC or the World Cup. Who's going to guarantee the check if there is this overage that you're talking about, Tim? In the U.S., private citizens, corporations. In the rest of the world, you have governments that come in and obviously can help guarantee any overages. The IOC, obviously, a large part of our budget comes from the TV rights dollars, the sponsors, so now we're talking about the revenue side. And we can go into that. But first, I want to ask Tom about, you put on an event that's ongoing. You may not have the billion-dollar TV budgets that the IOC has.
I'm feeling great relief not to deal with a great many of these issues.
But you rely a lot on sponsors, and maybe help illuminate how are you able to run such a great event year after year, and particularly on how the sponsors impact that.
Looking both to sponsors and the people who live around here, if I were to pick one word, it would be engagement, precisely because it is an ongoing process. First, we have to be engaged with the community. Those people, those 8 cities and towns through which the race, the Boston Marathon goes, or other events, they have to feel ownership, just as I'm sure cities that are putting out bids want their citizens engaged and feeling ownership. Sponsorship for us is different because we go directly to sponsors rather than working through organizing committees. And our principal sponsor, John Hancock, has been with us for 29 years, Adidas for more than 25 years. We have the opportunity to work with them and build a relationship and build them into the fabric of the event and into the fabric of the community in a way that's quite different from what happens in, say, an Olympic situation. We've also seen an evolution over a period of years in precisely what a sponsor is looking for. Once upon a time, many of us thought of a sponsor as somebody who put their name on an event. Now they are looking for more and more ways to do things, in the parlance of that world, to activate, whether it is to sell products or services or to advance their corporate social responsibility program. They want more and more fingers in the event in a way that advances their interests, which may or may not be commercial. But what it all calls for, above all, is a very high level of ongoing engagement.
So Tim or Doug, do you want to talk maybe on the other side? What are the revenue model of perhaps a World Cup or of a Olympic Games as compared to a Boston Marathon that really relies on that community support and that sponsor to help run that event?
Maybe I'll take a swing at it then, Tim. So for an Olympic Games, we'll go back to this distinction between the OCOG budget and the non-OCOG budget. The non-OCOG budget typically comes from long-term partners. The city itself, the city, the state, the region that needs the roads, that needs the infrastructure, and they are paying for those. It may, in the case of perhaps of a U.S. Games, if we look at Atlanta, we had partners. We had the Braves as a partner. We had Georgia Tech as a partner. We had universities, several of the universities who were partners who contributed a good deal of the amount for the non-OCOG, the permanent facilities that were going to be built because they needed those facilities after the games. Whereas the OCOG budget comes from the ticketing revenues, the broadcast revenues, the sponsorship revenues, and it is much more a typical, run like a typical business, where you're out and you're developing the revenues yourselves and bring them in, or actually, in many cases, of course, doing that in conjunction with the International Olympic Committee. So on the operating side, it is very much a balance the budget, dollars in, dollars out. On the non-OCOG side, it is those critical partnerships that you have to develop those facilities and the infrastructure.
So it's interesting that the money that's raised obviously helps go to directly putting on a large-scale event. Some of the extra surplus obviously goes back to the international sports federations at the IOC, goes back in running the administrative tasks of the IOC, goes back really into helping grow sports more globally, which obviously perpetuates the Olympic Games and helps athletes from around the world. So there's the way that the budget is created, obviously is a big part. How it's spent is a big part. I'm curious if you could do anything to change the way that major games are put on and hosted, either in the bidding process or the management itself of the games or in the legacy component. If any one of you would have any insights as to something that you see as a glaring issue that could creep up and really destroy the brand or destroy the viability of hosting a big event.
Angela, I'll touch that briefly. A couple of case examples. Go back to 1976 with the Montreal Olympic Games. The greatest cost overrun in the history of the Olympics, 796% cost overrun. It took them 30 years to pay off that debt. So when we talk about the economics of the world sporting events, I'm on the upfront side, Doug is on the delivery side in terms of the operation of the event itself and the economic benefits. How do you, just like in our own personal lives, how do I minimize the costs going into this so I derive the maximum economic benefit? When you look at many host cities, as we've looked over the last 30 years, the IOC, as a prime example, in their contract with the host city, has very little teeth in it relative to within the first year or the second year of delivery. If things are going wrong, what can they do besides berate them? Maybe berate them publicly, maybe challenge them, but there are no teeth in the contract. So how do you do that? The other aspect is, I would advocate that in those host city contracts, whether it's FIFA, whether it's the IOC, whoever the host agency is, needs to have some teeth in there to take action early on in that 7-year development life cycle. The second thing I would recommend is that there should be a requirement of a host city, not just to have a former Olympian as the head of the Olympic Committee and other people, because every one of these agencies, every one of these cities rather, are doing it for the first time in their life, for the most part. They bring in experts like Doug Arnott, they bring in other experts who go around the world to do these things, but the host city itself has got to have a team of experts inherent in their organization in order to manage these things from day one.
Yeah, I think particularly for this audience, it really is about getting to the detail beforehand. And as you mentioned with regard to, so in the process, there are volumes of materials that are developed for the International Olympic Committee. Whether they go through those volumes and with a fine-tooth comb the way they should in order to figure out who their partner is going to be is a question. But the detailed work done at the bid is absolutely crucial, because once that bid is awarded, those games aren't going anywhere else. I was on a phone call earlier today. Somebody was asking, well, is it really true that the games in Rio are going to be taken away and go someplace else? And the answer is no. The answer is they're going to happen in Rio. They may not happen they won't happen the way they happened in London. It will be different. It will, I'm sure, going back down there next week, I'm sure it'll all be fine. But the detail ahead of time, making sure that the detail is there, and so that you actually, so that you know that that organizing committee has a starting point, is absolutely crucial.
So in order to be provocative about the whole thing, I might say to somebody, why in the world would you ever subject yourself to all of this? Why not put on your own event that can be a continuing legacy event that you control? For example, the sort of thing that we have here, or you see in New York or Chicago with large marathons there, where you work directly with your partners in cities and towns, public safety, public service agencies. You work directly to arrange the economic relationships that you have, and working with those partners and engaging the entire community. You have a community event that goes on for years, can have a wonderful effect on the fabric of the community, and by the way, brings in a few bucks. If you look at the economic impact assessment done annually for the Boston Marathon, last year it was assessed that the marathon brought $142 million into the local economy for that weekend, which by way of comparison is about twice what you would get if you had the Final Four, the American College Basketball Championship that people bid like crazy to get. It happens twice in one weekend every year. If you go to New York and Chicago, those marathons, it's even bigger, and only the Super Bowl is bigger than those things. And if you want to rebuild a blighted part of your city, hire a contractor. Don't put on games.
It's the right question to ask, and the answer is a bit more complex, because it's the real return from an Olympic Games is very, very difficult to quantify, because the real return isn't the 17 days of the games. It isn't the tourism effect the next year. It isn't the tourism effect or the business development the next 2 or 3 years. The real change is you change the way a city, a country, feels about itself. I know, especially for an audience like this, that seems extraordinarily esoteric and a little bit difficult to quantify. But that is really the reason for doing this. The reason for hosting a games is because it changes the way people think about themselves. It changes the way they think about what they might do. And I have seen this in city after city after city. I can't speak specifically about Beijing and what the return was on Beijing, but I can say that the impact on politics in China, certainly there are some untoward impacts that we might have because of some of the partners that are chosen. But ultimately, it's unquantifiable because, and it's immeasurable because it can be so great. But it is very much a hearts and minds piece that ultimately translates into people understanding they can do more and they will do more as a city and as a country. I don't mean by any means to indicate that that does not happen with an event like the marathon, because I think it does. The magnitude, though, I think, is significantly different.
Yeah, you're talking about magnitude, sheer eyeballs. What do we have, 7 billion people in the world now, looking at one city, understanding a little bit more about that culture, understanding a little bit more about what it would be like to travel there. So you talk about long-term impact. But coming close to home, I think I want to, ask Tom, we suffered a great tragedy here last year with the Boston Marathon, and, no one will ever forget that. But by having a sports event, we've so much has been given back to the city. And maybe you can share, we talked a little bit about the Olympic impact, but how have you seen the community come together? And I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but maybe share a little bit of your insights on how just a sports event can impact a community.
Well, it was, of course, first and foremost a horror. It was something that caused sadness for everybody. A child died, a young girl died, a young lady died who just came to watch, an MIT police officer died for no reason. It was a horrible attack. It was an attack not on an event, but on Boston, on this region, on the United States, on a way of life, on freedom. And the response that came from that, the resilience, the determination of it, is what I think has come to be called Boston Strong in many quarters, which we have seen generally to mean that people here and people in a lot of other places will live their lives the way they choose, no matter what somebody does to try to stop them. And in the fabric of the community here in Boston, that goes back a long ways. It goes back 250 years to a time when people decided they would set up their own nation based on freedom. But starting in the first minutes afterwards, what we saw was that kind of determination from people who may have been employed public safety people or medical people or volunteers or just plain spectators when they ran toward bombs instead of away from those things. And it's that determination that I think we'll see again as we look to the Boston Marathon coming this year. And it's that sense of ownership among a community, however you define it, and there are a number of communities that work here, that really makes an event very, very special. And for any of you who are ever at any time working on setting up an event of any kind, it is something that you can aspire to. For us, we've had it for a long time, but it makes a difference. It makes it very special. And for those of us here in Boston, we have benefited immensely from the support that has come from around the world. It has been strong, and it has been sustaining. And that includes many of you, I'm sure. And as I say to any group I ever see, thank you for helping us through it, because what you did made a difference. But it also has brought out a community with a strength and determination that sometimes you don't know is there.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. I think we've all, obviously, as a Bostonian, been following it, and the impact that it's had on everyone's lives is enormous. And obviously, we're behind you and applaud what you continue to do with that event. I love sports. It's one of the few universal languages. Everyone understands sports. You don't have to speak the same language in the village. You can talk to other athletes. Everyone knows what a soccer ball is. You go into a disadvantaged community and you can bring a whole community together through a game. we talked a little bit about, this can't be quantified, and I'm wondering if either one of you have any other stories of the impact that sports, these major events that cost billions of dollars, and the cities struggle to say, we want to host an event. Why would you go out on a limb and risk your brand, risk your popularity if you're a politician, for example, risk the huge investment? Why would you do that?
I'd go back to a city not a year after the games, not 2 years after. I'd go back 10 years after. And I'd go back and I would ask what people are doing differently 10 years later that would not have been done if they had not had the games. What business has been started because somebody was inspired by the games? The numbers of people, we in London, we had 70,000 volunteers. I had under my sort of chain of command 230,000 people working on the games. The numbers of businesses generated by those people, the number of people who, again, sort of were, because they were inspired by what happened at the games, and inspired by the athletes. The athletes are at the center of it. The athletes are the beginning of it. But there's this ripple effect from the athletes that inspires people to do things again that they would not otherwise do. If you were to, I'd pick out a couple of things though. Having just finished the games in Sochi, it was remarkable to look at the U.S. team in Sochi and see the number of athletes who had been produced by the Utah Olympic Park. The Utah Olympic Park is one of the great sport legacy stories of the Olympic Games. It has produced Olympians, but it has produced thousands of other kids who have been engaged in sport who would never otherwise have been engaged in sport. If you take a look at Salt Lake City and ask the question 10 years later, what is Salt Lake City, today? Salt Lake City was, when I was working there at the games, was, for all intents and purposes, a fairly sleepy little town. Yes, it is the center of one of the world's significant religions. There were a lot of business generated, but look at the businesses now. Look at the businesses in the outdoor industry. Look at the businesses in the mountain industry. Look at the businesses that are there, attracted by the sport, and the jobs that have been developed as a result of that. We can tell the same story, frankly, with Atlanta. We can look at many of the things that have happened at the universities, in particular in Atlanta, that I would argue either would not have happened or would not have happened for another 20 years that have developed. So, to me, there are hundreds of stories, but the most poignant stories are the stories of individuals that you see 20 years after the games, and I've had that experience because I'm an old guy now. People who will come up to you who were a volunteer for 2 weeks and will tell you their lives were changed by being involved in the games. I have heard that thousands upon thousands upon thousands of times. So when it gets into quantifiables and it gets into measurable results, I don't know how you measure that, but I can tell you that it's very real.
Angela, if I could talk from the hard infrastructure, city building, urban development standpoint, as opposed to the jobs or benefit. First of all, I think we'll all agree we won't be able to get any number of economists to agree on what the economic benefit is. They'll disagree. But when you look at Rio right now, in Barata do Juca, where the Olympic Park is going to be, we've taken a contaminated lagoon and transforming that. Taken an abandoned F1 racetrack and regenerating that as new space. If you look at the development of favelas, a very, very controversial topic where hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced, hopefully for the better, in terms of the development of their communities, et cetera. But if you look also at Rio, just like a lot of these major cities where the games are, Rio de Janeiro has a great infrastructure system that's built for 1 million people. Unfortunately, Rio de Janeiro is a city of 10 million people. So the transportation infrastructure, the other infrastructure, number of hotel rooms, doesn't work right now. So if Rio is able to transform and leverage the Olympic Games to the development of the airport, of the development of the highways from the airport to the city, of going from downtown Copacabana to Barata do Juca in a more effective way, as opposed to taking 2.5 hours like it does now, through these offshoots of the Olympic Games, then that contributes to the success and the economic vibrancy of Rio as a developing city.
Can you talk a little bit about perhaps a city that changed their infrastructure in previous World Cup or in Olympics, and now we're seeing the effect in today? So instead of looking forward thinking, how's a major event actually impact a city today?
I think if you look at South Africa, the World Cup in South Africa, expenditures for South Africa for the World Cup was $2.6, $2.7 billion. The revenues derived from that was about $3.8 billion. Transformed a lot of their elements like that. London, we've talked about. Barcelona. Barcelona is one of the greatest examples of a city being transformed or regenerated in many components as a result of the Olympic Games. One of the highest cost overruns of the Games in that period of time, but a tremendous contribution to regeneration of the city. So those are probably a couple of the good examples.
As one for whom statistics are an unscratchable itch, I can't really add much to that. But hearkening back to what Doug said, there is a creation of a spirit in these cities or in connection with an event which is ineffable, hard to quantify, but exists and it subsists, it continues, and it makes a difference in places. If I were to quantify it in an odd way just in the marathon here in Boston, we can't begin to deal with all the people who want to come back and work this year. We've had to turn away 500 registered nurses, many of whom worked years in the past, who want to be involved because they were attacked, because their way of life were attacked. The spirit that has been there for so long, that is part of theirs, was attacked. And that's, I think, what Olympic Games can create as well, as a spirit of community that lasts for a long time.
I think one of the interesting things, if I can though, with the marathon, is being 118 years old, you've transformed the political aspect of this. You know, you touched before about on the political side. When you look at the Olympic Games build-up, right now the USOC is looking at city candidates possible for 2024, 10 years ahead. So you look at any of those cities, you look at Boston, everyone knows Boston is one of the cities that's being considered for 2024. Tom Menino was the mayor then, Marty Walsh is the mayor now, probably may not be the mayor if they win in 2024. So that political landscape and that shifting of some strong mayor like a Michael Bloomberg or a Rahm Emanuel or whoever it may be, that life cycle of a 10-year run to get to the opening ceremonies is fraught with danger. So the political risk associated with that is a very significant one, but you've been able to transform that. So we need to know what your winning formula is. Just develop it for 118 years and it's a success, right?
We go with all of those 3 million owners of the event whom I described before. They direct it.
No, you mentioned the politics of it, and it's obviously the Olympics, the World Cup, you like to keep the politics out. It's about coming together with no politics and just being under one roof. And that, I think, is to the contribution of humanity. And the Boston Marathon, obviously, you're turning away volunteers. I think I heard the London game had 70,000 volunteers. I mean, these major sports events ride on the back of volunteers who want to simply help their city, help their nation, put on a wonderful games, welcome the world to their communities. And that, I think, is fabulous. First of all, any volunteer I've ever met when I was competing was just wonderful and did so much for feeling the city, for really understanding the city. Is there anything any of you would add in terms of direct variables that could help the success of the games? We talk about volunteers as a major piece of hosting a successful games. Is there any other variable that you could see that could play a major part or does play a major part in actually hosting the game? Maybe it's the politicians and having a different policy in play.
I think Tom referenced this earlier. It really is about engagement. It's about starting off and bidding responsibly, bidding a responsible games, and bidding honestly, and being transparent with the people of the city so that they can, in fact, become part of the event from the outside. And then it's a continuing engagement with the city. I think one of the things we did very well in London was the engagement of the people, not just of the City of London, but of all of Great Britain. And that engagement is no mean task. It is something that you have to stay after day after day after day, and you have to be listening to the complaints and responding to the complaints. You have to be talking to the people in the favelas who might be moved in a situation like Rio. You have to be very honest with your own approach and be quite certain that what you, at least in your own heart, you have to know that what you're telling the people of that city is doable, it's doable within that budget, and that you believe you're going to be able to get the kinds of returns from that event that you're proposing at the bid stage. So it's transparency, honesty, and engagement.
And if
When
you're,
we-
go ahead.
No, please.
And if you're not honest with them, it won't work. And there is no more telling moment for our race director in the Boston Marathon, Dave McGilvery, and I, than when the gun goes off for the marathon each year. We now know, we have just taken this thing that so many people have worked on for a year this time and handed it over to 8,500 people that mostly we don't know. They're not paid, they got a yellow jacket. So all those things that Doug described better have gone on very effectively before, or you're going to have a pretty bad day on your hands.
One of the things we try and do for major events like that have a gestation of 7 years, is recognizing that 7 years after selection, the people who are in high schools or secondary schools or whatever the city is will be the adults working in positions. You know, the 18-year-olds are going to be a 25-year-old person. So we partner with secondary schools and vocational technical schools wherever we are for a massive internship program through the entire life cycle, so that by the time the games are finished, we don't just have stadia, arena, training facilities, and transportation infrastructure in place. We have a human capital development as well of people who have been trained and worked with us over the years who are now coming into these positions, so that when we leave and after the 17 days is over, these people are there with all that skill and that knowledge inherent, and it's not just going on to the next venue.
Yeah, I think in terms of, we were talking before, I think Doug, you mentioned, it's a city bid, but it's a national bid. You know, if we're going to host, and I'm on the U.S. Olympic Committee, on the working group, if we're going to host, I believe it really has to be a national bid. Boston, obviously, or any other thcities that are vying for it should be a part of it, but I mean, every button I saw in London was Team GB, not London, so just food for thought. So I have some questions now from the audience. So thank you again for your contribution. We'll start with Tom. What are the new challenges organizing this year's marathon, and did the registrations decrease this year?
Going to the second one, well, let's see, challenges. The real challenge this year is living up to the standards, to the strength and the determination of all the people who have supported us. That's at the highest level. One level down is having a race this year in the Boston Marathon that is the Boston Marathon, an international athletic competition focused on excellence. There'll be events leading up to it that are tribute events, but when we get to the day of the race, it should be an example of that determination of which I spoke before, moving forward. And the most difficult balance will be between assuring safety and security, which our public safety partners do, and at the same time, making sure that people can enjoy the day, the event, the weekend as one of joy and celebration as it has always been. That'll be a difficult balance to strike, but it's one that everyone is working very hard to achieve. In terms of numbers, Boston Marathon is a little different from all other mass participation races in that for the most part you have to run a qualifying time for your age and gender in order to get into it. And normally we have 27,000 people because the roads are the same ones that were there in 1897. They haven't gotten any bigger. So we can only accommodate that many people. This year, however, we'll have another 9,000, 5,000 of whom are those people who weren't able to finish last year. And since we normally start in waves of 9,000, rather than have a fourth wave of 5,000, we added another 4,000 people with the huge support of all of our public safety partners, made up of people who one way or another were profoundly affected by what happened last year. So there are more people and all those challenges that I described.
Good luck. Tim, question for you. How can countries really justify hosting the games when many venues they build for the games go unused afterwards? Isn't this a waste of money?
I think as we touched on that before, I totally agree. Within the capacity of what is the master plan for the development and the vision of that city. So if these games are going to leave and the venues are still there, if that fits into the development scenario for the rest of the country, like Qatar as part of their Vision 2030, then that does become successful. But if you have a waste like a bird's nest that's sitting there empty right now, that is totally unviable in this day and age, especially when you look at what is the opportunity cost of these billions of dollars. You know, the average cost for the Olympic Games since 1960 is about $2 billion. If you look at the last three, you look at London at $15 billion. If you look at Sochi at $51 billion. If you look at Beijing at $34 billion. The opportunity cost associated with some of that money going to something else, and this is the big debate in Rio right now, can be very significant. So I totally agree. So I think the idea, I think Doug touched on this very well, the idea of temporary venues, demountable venues that see the life of the Olympic and the Paralympic Games, but then can be taken down and transformed into something else or someplace else is probably the most effective way and the most effective spend.
Do you think this should be something that the IOC, for instance, considers a legacy for each and every sporting venue that should be explicit in the bid process? Or is this, obviously the host nation can decide what to do with these facilities, but should this be something we as the IOC takes more control over early on in the process?
Yeah, if I can, I think there needs to be a much better balance struck with the IOC taking the lead. It would go back to what we talked about in terms of the federations. If you can't demonstrate that there is a community need, a city need for that specific facility after the games, and you can't talk about the business plan for that facility for the next 20 years, you shouldn't be building that facility as a permanent facility. You should be building it as a temporary facility. Temporary facilities are still costly. It's still about 60 to 70% of what the permanent build might be for many of the venues. But you don't drive by that white elephant every day, and you're not maintaining it every day, and you're not losing the opportunity cost for that land. So more and more, if you look at the London plan, even within the Olympic Park, of the 6 venues in the Olympic Park, only 3 of them continue as venues after the games. The rest are gone. If you look at the venues, our beach volleyball venue, our equestrian venue, I can name venue after venue after venue. Those venues are gone now, and the land has been returned to the use that it was prior to the games, or turned to what the community determined was a better use afterwards. But I think it is something that the IOC, instead of talking sort of strictly, there's much more of a tendency to be talking about specific sport legacy or some more esoteric legacies with regard to the community. I think actually asking specifically with each one of the facilities, what is the business plan for that afterwards, and taking that back into the games plan to say, okay, it's a permanent or it's a temporary, would be highly beneficial.
Yeah, you might decrease the risk. I know that's one thing the IOC looks at constantly. What's the risk of every venue, of every aspect of the game? And that plays into the next question I have for the panel. What are the economic implications of increased security efforts at these events? So it's a big budget item, the security, but perhaps someone has a thought with their individual.
The security budgets are astronomical. The security budget now I can't even gauge what it would have been for Sochi, but I can tell you that the security budgets are nearing $1 billion per games. That is infrastructure, some of which is usable afterwards and can be moved. It's your fences, it's your PIDs, it's your CCTV. There are a lot of movable positions on that, so there is a return there that you can get it by selling assets afterwards. But it is the cost of the personnel is enormous. The cost of training. It's an overwhelming cost, and it is one that is out there as something that may become insurmountable for some cities. And part of that has to be it all needs to be incorporated into that plan that is part of the bid. When you're bidding the plan, how is your security plan? How is that security infrastructure plan in particular? Because there's a lot of cost to that. How is that incorporated into the bid so that you know that you're getting the most economical return? You have the greatest number of venues within a secured perimeter, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a tough one, and it's not one that that any of us could do without the help of the host government.
It is a big issue for us right now, of course, in Boston with the marathon coming, and people wanting to be safe. We really are public safety partners. We put on a race. Public safety partners take care of security. But people have to be safe, at the same time feel safe, see enough security that it makes them feel comfortable, but not so much that they're in a police state. It will cost a lot of money. What are the economic implications? Everything gets more expensive. And there's a conversation going on right now, as you might imagine, as to who will bear the various elements of that cost. But riding above that is that same determination of which I spoke before, to make things go forward so that people live their lives the way they want, so that the scoundrels, the cowards who showed up with those bombs last year don't win.
Angela, I think one of the things that's, when you look at the total cost of the games, you go through all of the world games, not just the Olympics, our analysis shows that over the last 30 years, about 60 to 75% of the cost for the games and the work has nothing to do with sports, nothing to do with a sports facility or a venue, but it's infrastructure, it's security, it's utilities, it's housing, all those elements. So security now has become the largest, increased component of that. So there's a big spend on that. So any city that's looking at those things needs to understand that in totality.
So I have a question. Do you think the reasoning behind selecting host nations from the bidding processes will become more transparent moving forward? The way that, at least on the IOC, the bidding works is great consultants come together and give the IOC members, right now there's a little over 100 IOC members, the opportunity to learn more about the cities. We don't visit the cities. A decade or so ago, IOC members were able to visit and see firsthand. Now we rely on bid presentations. We rely on getting to know the bid themselves, all the people that are involved, asking lots of questions. We have a first bid presentation. It's usually 3 months prior to the actual vote. And so there's two real prime opportunities to get in front of IOC members who vote in a secret ballot. So in terms of transparency, I think the members themselves, some of them really want more opportunities to go visit the cities. They want more information. They read through every detail of what's presented. Others may not. They may rely more on relationships. They may rely more on where they think the games should go. For example, in Rio, I think a lot of IOC members believed South America was time to go to that part of the world. So in terms of transparency, I think the IOC is doing everything possible to educate the members so that they can make an educated vote. And I don't know if you have any, maybe the two of you have any suggestions as to either the World Cup or the Olympics, but how could we change this process so that it's more fair, so that the people involved, not just the members themselves, but the cities, the countries that are posing this enormous question to their citizens can make a really valid judgment call as to if they should host these games?
I think that what the IOC should be demanding of the cities is the same thing that I see most of the cities that we're engaged with demanding of themselves, which is responsibility to the community. It's back to what we talked about before, and it's I don't know what you can, in terms of the process. I think there are a lot of different elements to the process that I think could change, but the one that, as it relates specifically to sports facilities, and I'll sort of stay with that one, because that's the one where we find the white elephants afterwards. We need to go back to what we talked about before. What is the long-term use of that facility? What is the business plan for that facility? Who are the partners that are working with you on that facility? If you cannot answer those questions, then you don't have a plan.
Tim,
Yeah,
Tom?
You know, I look at that, you know, you look at the evaluation criteria for a host, for a candidate city. You look at the scoring that's done by the evaluation commission. Very, very, you know, mechanical, very analytical. You know, great, here's the results they present to the body of the IOC members. The IOC members take all that, and then, as you say, they go into a secret ballot, and they say, yeah, I think this one scored very high, that was great. But, you know, I think Tom's a great guy, so I'm going to vote for Boston. You know, it happens. So, and maybe for valid reasons, but, you know, I think it's a very tough question. I think it's a very human question. You're closer to it than any of us, obviously, being on that side of the curtain. What do you think?
I believe it's something, you know, with the new president, President Bach, we're looking at everything. We're looking at the 2020 plan. How do we build the brand of the IOC? How do we ensure that the games are a success, that everyone involved is happy with that? And I think ultimately that's what this panel is all about. How do we create a positive impact when we host these major sports events? And we're right now reevaluating everything, and we'll get together in Monaco, and I'll let you know when we figure that out. But closing comment, and then we need to wrap this up.
Ooh, sorry,
No, please.
just an observation on that from one not involved in the process at all, but one who has spent decades as a business lawyer, securities lawyer. I haven't seen anything that doesn't benefit from having a little more sunshine on it. The more transparent it is, the more people get to understand precisely what's going on, the more confidence they have in it.
So hopefully you can all join me in a round of applause for our panelists today. Thank you very much.
That's good fun. Good job.